Okay, well, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to talk about one of the most powerful concepts in object-oriented programming. And this is a concept called inheritance. So what is inheritance? Well, I think the best way to describe inheritance is to take it in a concept of a design that we're already familiar with. So in previous videos, we looked at this design in the last video where we have a student that can enroll in a course, right? So the course maintained an array of students, okay? An array of students that are enrolled in the course. Maybe the course also has a professor that teaches the course, okay? Well, there are some properties that might be shared across a student and a professor, okay? The fact that they're both people. And we can avoid having redundancy in our code by taking advantage of that and trying to have any sort of logic that might be shared between a student and a professor and put it into one location. So let's look at how this design would work. This modified design based on this this understanding of inheritance, and it's easier to explain by drawing it out. So let's say we've got a student. Okay, so we have a student class. Okay. And let's say we've got a student has a first name, a last name, okay, maybe an age, and a GPA. Okay. And maybe we'll even go one step further. We'll say that they also has a student ID. All right. Or to actually be a little bit more specific, we might even say, let's give the student a university ID. Okay. Which you all have, right? And let's imagine then we have a professor class. Let's think about what attributes there might be for a professor, right? What data constitutes a professor? Well, maybe we also have a lot of the same information. First name, last name. Maybe we also are storing age. Okay. GPA might be different. We're not going to have a GPA. But let's say we also have a university ID. Okay. And maybe we have, I don't know, something like years of service or department. Let's use department. Okay, the department that the professor works in. Okay. And maybe you could even have other things, right? Like phone number, office location. Okay. Well, a key thing to note here, though, is some information is the same. Okay. We've got some information that is shared amongst both the student and the professor. Okay. And we can exploit this with a concept called inheritance that allows us to take a single class, which we're going to call a superclass, and I'm going to call it a person. Okay, it's a person in the context of the university. And I'm going to have a single class for a person that contains all of the shared information. Okay, and what that'll allow me to do is I won't need to include that down here. Okay, because this is going to be something that we refer to as a superclass. And these down here are our sub classes, okay? And what they're going to do is they are going to inherit or it's oftentimes drawn like this, okay, they're going to inherit all of those properties from a person, okay? One key thing to note is these are usually something referring to as a relationship, okay? A professor is a person. Not all of you might not agree with that, right? But technically speaking, right, a professor is a person. Same with a student. A student is a person. So you have this is a relationship that we're defining between a person and whether it's a person and a student or a person and a professor, okay? And is a relationship. And we are inheriting properties from the superclass. And now, why do we care about doing this? The key idea is we're able to remove redundancy, right? It's typically a really bad thing to have the same thing, the same logic written in multiple places, right? Code gets very complex, right? You have lots of people working on it over years and years and years on different systems, right? In real life, code gets very complex. And what you don't want is you don't want to have a situation in which if you got the same code or same logic written in multiple places, that if you're trying to update something, you got to find multiple places where you have to update that logic, okay? It also is a powerful concept in terms of how you can write logic that deals with these operations of what a person is, and you don't care if the logic is for a student or a professor, right? So like maybe someone's no longer with the university and you want to get rid of their account, right? That kind of remove operation could take place whether or not it's a person or a student, so the person, it would work for either a professor or student with the same type of code. We'll come back to that. We'll look at that a little bit deeper, okay? So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to keep this simple in this video and then we can expand on it a little bit later on. But what I would like to do is let's take a look at this in the context of our code base, all right? So let's go to the previous, we're going to open up some code here. And I want to add the professor class, okay? And we're going to build it, and then we're going to expand on it so that we're going to build this person superclass, and we're going to have the student and professor inherit those properties, okay? All right, so let's go and let's take a look at the code. Okay, so we're looking at this code here, and this is expanding off what we saw previously. And right now we've got three classes. We've got the main class, the student class, and the course class. Let's go ahead. Let's add the professor class here. Okay. And I'm going to add a bunch of data members, private data members for the professor. So we've got the first name, right? Last name, maybe we got, we have things like age. We're going to do a university ID, make that an integer. Maybe we have a phone number. We'll also in this example make that an integer. Maybe a string for the office location. Okay. So we have these properties, and we could build getters and setters to, to expand on this, right? We can go ahead and do that. So if we look at building getters and setters, we already have a whole bunch in terms of how we built the student. It's very similar. And one of the things that we're going to look at is that we've got a we know that we have some data that is shared. So let's just jump ahead here. Let's just build a bunch of getters and setters. Let's build the constructor for this. We'll do it in a similar way as before. This is kind of similar to what we did with the student class. The logic that we're implementing here is we're saying that the professor must always have a name. Okay. The name has to be defined. There's no way we're not allowing creating like a student without the name being defined. We're also having additional constructor for the age, okay? And we're gonna do that here with the name must be defined. So the only way to create the professor is to define that. And then we have a bunch of getters and setters. Okay, so we've got these getters and setters that have now been defined. And the key thing to notice is that we've kind of mentioned before is we've got these shared properties. We've got something, these first name, last name, age, and university ID is shared for professor. And we're going to also have the student have all of that too. And a matter of fact, let me just add university ID here, because we're going to assume that that is also defined, and so we should also have a getter and setter for that, right? So and we're going to notice something is that that right now this is kind of a suboptimal way of designing something, and the reason for that is that we're repeating a lot of important information. Okay, we've got these getters and setters that are defined in multiple places. We have them in the student class, we have them in the course class. Right? There's a certain amount of redundancy that we have in terms of how this is built. Okay, so now we're going to fix this, going back to our previous design that we saw at the beginning of this video, where we're going to look at how we can use inheritance. Okay, and to do that, we're going to build a superclass. I'm going to build a class here. I'm going to call it person. Okay. And person's going to look really, really similar to what we were looking at in those other classes. So effectively what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this information here. Okay. First, last, age, university ID. I'm going to go into person. I'm saying, hey, person has those properties. Okay. I could also grab, we could look at the constructor here. Okay, I'm also going to define a constructor for person. Okay, that's going to contain, has to, again, the name of the constructor must match the name of the class. This looks all really, really similar, right? I'm going to do some getters and setters too. We got the university ID, age, not GPA, but we're going to grab these. Okay, we're going to paste those in here. Okay, we also need the first name, last name, which actually, those names we're gonna, that depends on what you want, right? We can set those too. We can say first name, last name, set name. We can move those up here too. And have those getters and setters. Okay. And so now we have a person that has these properties and the getters and setters and everything associated with it. Well, what that's going to allow us to do is we can do, this is a key thing related to how we can use the superclass, is I'm going to say student extends the person's class. Okay, it extends, right? Notice it extends turns blue, indicating it's a reserved word. It's a special term within the code logic saying a person extends these properties of what it means to be a person. Okay, and because of that, right, all of the properties in the superclass are now defined. So I can drop this, okay, here, and notice that property doesn't exist anymore. I just deleted it. Okay. What I can do is I can actually do this a couple different ways. I can say super dot for, you know, to indicate the superclass. And actually, what's more of a common way of doing this is to call the constructor. Okay, this is let me kind of explain what this is doing because it's kind of a key point. This here, super, that goes to the superclass and calls that constructor. Okay, super says, notice it extends person. What that does is it goes to the class that's being extended, right, that it's inheriting properties from. It goes to it and calls that constructor. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing down here to call the other constructor. Okay, I can't use these anymore because first, last, and age no longer exist inside of this class, right? They're technically in the superclass. In the superclass. Oh, it's not GPA, it's age. Let's see. Oh, and I never defined that up here, right? This one doesn't have that. It just has one constructor. So I'm gonna take that out. We have one or two options. We either have to add it or we have to remove it here, right? Either add it in the superclass or remove it in the subclass. I'm just gonna remove it in the subclass. Okay, we're also gonna drop all these getters and setters here. They're all in the superclass. So I'm gonna get rid of that. I'm gonna get rid of this. Okay. All right, I'm going to come back to display. Let's look at that later on. Okay, let's look at that later on. First, I'm going to get this to compile. All right, so we have this. What it means to be a student, right? And extends a person. And I'm going to have to come back to this. Now I'm in the course, and I can do the same thing, right? Course can I'm sorry, not course. Professor also extends person. And I'm going to drop these properties. First name, last name, age, and university ID. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to call the superclass constructor. Okay. Again, just to remind you what that's doing. This here, so now we're in the constructor of the professor, right? When I call super with these same properties, I'm calling the person constructor. So it's almost like it's going into this constructor and then it calls the one. You're saying, hey, delegate responsibility to what you're inheriting from. Okay, so this allows you to kind of share the same constructor across multiple subclasses. Okay. I can get rid of some of these getters and setters, right? All right, and so here's a couple of key things to notice, right? Notice I reduce the amount of code and actually quite dramatically, right? The amount of code in student and in professor, right? It's shared now. It's shared in one location in the person class, the person superclass. Okay, I might have to make a little bit of a minor change here. We don't have this constructor for the student right now, so maybe we have to tweak it a little bit to get this to work. These constructors that we had previously took the age. If we just drop that, the only constructor we have takes 2 strings. We could always we have the setter. Notice that student has if I do an object of type student and I do Adam.setAge, okay, we'll say maybe 20. Notice setAge, that's a valid function to call. Okay, notice the student class does not have that defined in here anywhere. Okay, the student class does not have setAge defined anywhere in here. Where is it? It's in the superclass. Okay, but it inherits those methods. It inherits those properties, not only the data, but also the functions. Okay, so that I could still use this here. I could use that function for both a student, or I could also use it for a professor, which we haven't added in here yet. Okay. So, all right, I'm just going to add a couple. Just going to add the age here. We're using that. Remember, it's being called in the, it's being shared, okay, across multiple, it's being shared across multiple subclasses, right? We have one superclass that includes the setAge function. Even though the professor and the student don't have it, we're going to be able to use it. Okay, let me kind of show you a little bit more how this works. Let's imagine here, one thing that we never added to the course is let's add a course actually has a professor that teaches it. Okay, and I'm going to add some getters and setters for that, where we define a course, right? Maybe initially when we initialize the course, the professor's name is just blank. Okay, so in the constructor, remember the professor is not just a name, it's we're to say new professor. And let's take a look, like how are we able to create a professor? Well, actually, anytime we create a professor, we must give it a name. Okay, so that's interesting, right? We must give a name anytime we give a professor. So maybe for a course, to define a course, we could change this. We can make it where we, maybe we want to allow creating a professor without a name too. Right? It doesn't do anything. Right? It's just the default constructor. It just allows you to create the professor without having any properties or any initial inputs. And so that will allow us to do something like this. Okay. Now, if we do that, it should be, we're going to have to set the name later. So like in the person class, we actually have that already. All right. Well, what do I mean by that? Okay. So we're going to maybe have maybe we want to have a function called assign professor, right? And that we're just going to allow something like that, okay? So that the professor can get assigned later on. We have this getters and setters. This is actually more of a setter. Down here, just trying to keep the code organized. We got our setters down below. Okay, so we got this assigned professor, so we have that property as well. Okay, so let's see, something not compiling here. We'll take a look, possibly. I don't see an error. But let's look back over here, and I'm going to temporarily remove a couple things. And what I want to do is let's assign a professor to teach this course now. Okay, so we're creating a course here. Let's create a professor too, and I'm going to make it me, because I'm not clever enough to come up with another name. And I think we have one option of creating this. Yes, first name, last name. All right, and then when we create the course here, I can say assign professor, right? So to indicate who is teaching that class. Okay, so we have those properties, right? We're assigning a professor's teaching that class. And notice that what I'm kind of getting at here, though, is I can also have certain properties here. Like if I wanted to set my office location, so if I li 69E is where it's currently at. Okay, so I could set these different locations, and I can use some properties here, right? The set office location happens to be in the subclass, right? It's in the professor class. All right. I also have the ability to use properties. Like if I look at the set properties here, right? I have ones like set age and set name and so forth, or set university ID. And these are ones that are in the superclass, right? They're in the person class. Okay, because professor being a subclass inherits all those properties from the superclass. Okay. Now let's see, I probably have something, I wrote a lot of code. It's usually a bad idea to write this much code. Oh, it's supposed to be an int, not a string. Usually a bad idea to write this much code without kind of compiling and testing things. Let's see what I broke. I bet there's something broken here. Yep. Let's see. So we've got professor, line 9, constructor person in class, blah, 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 cannot be applied to given type. Okay, so let's look at the constructor here. Line 9, it doesn't like that. I think it's because I did not call the superclass. Okay, what I might do is I might take that out. Okay, then that breaks over here. We can set this maybe to null at first. Okay, the reason being that we're setting it to null, we're expecting that at some point this is called. Okay, so that error came up, by the way, because a subclass should always call the superclass constructor. Okay, so that's why that came up, that error, which is a good thing to point out. Okay, so that compiled successfully. I don't think we're going to have much of anything to look at here because I removed a lot of the display things. Right? So there's really not, yeah, it's not really showing much, but we could do things like maybe if we want to display a person. This is actually an interesting example to see, and we'll kind of end on this going through it. I'm going to put a display up here, right? I'm going to put a function called display, and I'm going to have that function display the last name, first name, and age, and maybe one other thing. Well, we'll just leave it at that. We'll split the first name, last name, and age. We'll ignore the other stuff. Okay. And so what that allows me to do is I can come back over to the main here, and I can use this. Right, let me uncomment out. We had this display roster we can use that. Right, display roster is now going to display, right, and when that's called display, there is no display anymore in the student class. I commented out. Okay, it will still work because there's a display here in the person class. Excuse me. So, okay, well, how does that work? Right, it's going to call the superclass by default. So if I could also, uncomment this like what we did in the last video. Run this code. Okay, we compile it. All right, and run it. Right, we see those displays work correctly. Okay, I also have the ability to do something like this. Well, actually, I don't have a get professor option. So like if we go back to course, one thing that we had an assign professor. Let's say let's have a get. Let's have a get professor option. Okay. So we can find out who's teaching the course. Okay, and I can also do this. ECE 141 dot get professor dot display. Okay, so you're able to say something like indicating who the teacher is. Okay, and notice one of the key things I am indicating here is that this display function is shared across both the student and the professor because they inherit those properties. Okay, actually I never set the age, so apparently I'm newborn. All right. So one other thing here, all right, I want to kind of change this a little bit. Let's imagine we want to, maybe sometimes it makes sense to have a default display. you can also, maybe we want it to be a little bit different, the display for a student, that we want to have the student display also the GPA. Okay, to display, notice the student to display the GPA. Okay, and I'm going to use these getters, right, to go into the superclass. This is a little bit in the weeds here, maybe more than we want to get down into. But I can get the first name and last name. Let me go on to the next line so you can see it. GPA. Oops. That was already there. Okay, so age, we're going to do super.get age. Okay. Super calls the superclass. It inherits those properties, right? I can use those methods up above, get the last name, first name, age, and GPA belongs to the subclass, right? Well, what am I getting at here? What I'm getting out here is, look what happens if I run this. Okay. Is now when I display students, I'm also displaying the GPA. Okay, so I'm displaying the name, age, GPA. The professor only displays the name and age. Okay, what I've effectively done is, if I have a function with the same name in a subclass, okay, it overrides the properties in the superclass. This is in the person class. It's called display. It does not have a GPA associated with just a generic person. Okay, but a student we can override that by, if we have this in here, right, in the subclass, this will be the default one that's run for a student object when you hit that object.display. All right, that gets pretty advanced, right? I want you to understand the main principles, the main foundational principles for inheritance. Going down into getting super good at and everything, that you can kind of build later on, but building on the foundation, I think, is really what we want to kind of get towards, is that you have an understanding of the basic principles, right? And the basic principles here is we have the data, right, and logic, right? We have some functions that we can share across classes, right, that inherit those properties. And that usually the sharing happens where we have this is a relationship. A student is a person. So a student extends what it means to be a person. Professor extends a person, right? And if professor extends what it means to be a person, okay? So we have these properties, right? And it allows us to have logic, right? Data and logic in one location, and then have that be inherited by those subclasses. Okay, exceptionally powerful concept, right? A very foundational concept related to object-oriented programming. All right, let me stop there. Right, it is a tough concept. Please rewatch. All right, I intentionally, I know I go through the code examples kind of fast, and that really is by design. I just assume that the fact that this is recorded, you've got the power to stop, rewatch things, right? And kind of, go through it at a pace that makes sense to you. So I'm doing this in a way of assuming you're going to stop and rewatch portions of it, right? All right, feel free to ask questions. That's what we're here for, right? Practice, practice, practice. We're really close to being done with any of new concepts, okay? So hang on in there, all right? And be safe and well, everybody.